All right, as we move on to lesson 33, we've been talking in this module all about fiscal policy. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about macroeconomics is that, as I've alluded to before in these lessons, not everyone exactly agrees with all of the tenets of macroeconomic theory. Unlike with microeconomics, where everything seems to be very packaged and we follow laws of supply and laws of demand, in macroeconomics there's a little bit more debate going on. And to illustrate that, I want to talk about something that I'm calling the different visions of the short run aggregate supply curve. Let's remember what we've looked at so far this year. And actually, if you look at the top of the screen there, it says the classical model of supply and aggregate demand. Well, the first thing is we have a long run aggregate supply curve. Now, here's the good news. Everyone agrees that the long run aggregate supply curve is sloped upwards. Why? We know why, because we learned earlier, way back, I think in module 3, that in the long run, all prices and all wages catch up to each other over time. So in the long run, if prices rise, it doesn't really matter because all of the wages and all the other prices should rise to match. So the long run aggregate supply curve, everyone sort of agrees, is this perfectly inelastic, if you remember microeconomics, or perfectly vertical curve. Okay, the other thing that we learned in classical economics, what we've used all year long, is that the short run aggregate supply curve slopes upward. That, by the way, is the model that you probably should use in any question that's asked on the AP exam, unless they specifically mention a different theory. But generally speaking, we're going to use the classical model as our default. And of course, we also have our aggregate demand curve. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the aggregate demand curve. We're mostly going to focus on the supply curve. By the way, just a reminder, the reason the supply curve slopes upwards, according to the classical model, is because of, you may remember, something called the sticky wage theory. And that said that if inflation was high, if price levels were high, then the real value of people's wages would probably be less than what it would have been otherwise, because people have to negotiate wages over a long period of time. They don't change as fast as prices do, or in other words, they're sticky. And if those wages are low, then the cost of production is also low, which means the quantity of our GDP would increase. That's a bit of review, but that's why the classical theorists believe that the short run supply curve slopes upwards. We're going to look at two other versions of the aggregate supply curve today. Just remember, in this theory, the wages are sticky. That's that famous phrase. They're not stuck, and they're not totally flexible. In other words, they move with prices, but they don't move as fast as prices do. Okay, we're going to move next to a model called the Keynesian model of aggregate demand, aggregate supply. And this is very famously named after the economist John Maynard Keynes. In this module, I actually have a biography of his that I'd like you to look at. Normally, we don't discuss individual economists, but his contributions have been so significant over the last 100 years that he's somebody we talk about specifically. Okay, here's what makes Keynes's theory unique. Keynes believed that the aggregate supply curve was essentially very elastic, or much more horizontal. And for illustration purposes, we're going to say it's completely horizontal. Well, what does that really mean? What it really means is that, let's suppose we have an aggregate demand curve and we have an equilibrium price. What Keynes believed was that when you increased aggregate demand, like I just did here, you'll notice what happens. Our GDP increases, but the price level stays exactly the same. In other words, what Keynes believed was that you could increase aggregate demand and not create inflation. And that was a really important consideration, because one of the theories that had gone before Keynes for many years was that anytime that the government increased spending, it would inevitably create inflation, create crowding out, and that was not good. Keynes comes along and says, no, the aggregate demand curve, the aggregate supply curve is horizontal, or mostly horizontal. And because it is, you can increase aggregate demand, for example, by doing government spending, and not create any rise and inflation. And the reason for that is that wages, he believed, were essentially stuck, were very sticky. And by that he meant that There were so many people often who were unemployed, especially during the Great Depression, which is when Keynes did a lot of his work. There were so many people that were unemployed, and there were so many resources not being used that you could ask all of those resources to be used more and not make them more expensive. The opposite of Keynes's theory, by the way, just as a quick note, the summary point you want to take from this is that an increase in AD results in increases in AD result in greater GDP, but no change in prices, no change in inflation. That's the summary point that you need to really walk away from Keynes with. All right, a theory that is exactly the opposite of Keynes is a theory or is a school of thought called the rational expectationist model. Now, that's kind of a strange sounding name, but you'll see why in a minute they use that name. First, we should note what their main theory is. Their main theory is that the short run aggregate supply curve is completely inelastic or completely vertical. Now notice it's the short run aggregate supply curve, not the long run curve. Because that's true, they believe that here's an aggregate demand curve. When you increase aggregate demand, what are you essentially doing? Well, if that's your initial price and you increase aggregate demand, look what you've done. All you've really done is created a higher price. Our GDP has not changed. Well, what's the implication of this? The implication of this was sort of a pushback against Keynes. Keynes argued that during the Great Depression, the government needed to step in and increase aggregate demand. The rationalists say government increasing aggregate demand, all it's doing is creating higher prices and crowding out the economy, while it's not doing much of anything to create any more RGDP. And they believe this is true because, unlike Keynes, who believes wages are very inflexible, or I use the phrase stuck, the rationalists believe wages are very flexible, meaning that as soon as prices rise, wages should go with them. That's why they're called the rational expectationists. They believe that people rationally expect inflation to occur, and therefore they negotiate wages that keep up with that. The takeaway point, though, again, in summarizing this, is this. Increases in AD result in higher prices, but no change in RGDP, according to the rationalists. Keynes believed the opposite, but the rationalists believe that increasing AD will do no good at all as far as producing more RGDP. Here's a little chart that helps summarize this entire thing. If you'd like to stop the recording for a minute and just kind of look this over, it would be probably a good idea. The classical one at the top is the one we'll be using throughout the course of most of this course and have been using. It's an upward sloping supply curve. And therefore, when prices increase, inflation increases, RGDP increases, unemployment decreases. In the Keynesian theory, we have the supply curve is horizontal. If we have an aggregate demand increase, the prices will stay the same, which means inflation stays the same, RGDP increases, and unemployment decreases. Lastly, the rationalists, if we have an aggregate demand increase, they believe that prices and inflation will increase, but that means that RGDP and unemployment aren't going to change at all. By the way, the combined model of all this, and this is actually the one that I learned when I took AP Macroeconomics a number of years ago, was this model. First, it started with Keynes's version, the short-run aggregate supply curve being totally elastic or totally horizontal. We then had the classical model, and lastly, we had the rational expectation portion. So our supply curve was actually three pieces, and sort of almost like an arc. And if you think about it, it actually makes a lot of sense. What it really was saying was this. It was saying that down here, where unemployment was very high, if it makes sense that there were so many resources that weren't being used, that as they increased our GDP, there really was no reason to pay people more or to push prices up because there were so many people who just wanted jobs. So wages tended to be more, as Keynes would say, stuck, or as I would say stuck. Keynes would say probably inflexible. As we move along and we get into sort of the normal world here, we have that sort of trade-off relationship where wages aren't stuck, they're sticky. that prices are rising, and so are wages, but wages don't rise as fast as prices. This is sort of the normal world. And then we also get to a point where you have this situation where you've moved so far this way, so far to the right in our graph, that our GDP is so high and unemployment is so low that no matter how hard you push the economy, there's no more room for it to grow. It doesn't have any more resources to grow. So all you're going to do is push prices up. So actually, because that's the case, we would actually say that this is full employment. Now, I'm not going to actually suggest that you learn this graph for the AP macroeconomics course. In the course today, 90% of the time, 99% of the time, just using the straight classical model is fine. And generally speaking, I haven't seen them ask you to graph either the rationalist or the Keynesianists. They would only ask you a question, a multiple choice question about that. So I don't suggest you necessarily learn this graph or use this graph. I only show it to you to help illustrate why it is that there's some tension between economists. It seems the overall conclusion is that when the economy is doing very poor, Keynes was probably right. Most of the time, the classicalists prevail, and as the economy reaches full employment, you have much more truth to the rational expectationist model. All right, let's do an example to wrap things up. Suppose there is an increase in government spending. According to the Keynesian theory, what happens to price, output, inflation, and unemployment? Okay, government spending increases. We know that Keynes says that when you increase government spending or increase AD, you have no change in price and therefore no change in inflation. So that's what Keynes would look like. And the answer, prices and inflation remain the same. Output increases, which causes unemployment to decrease. Again, Keynes was a big advocate of using the government's power to increase aggregate demand because he did not believe there was much trade-off with inflation. Example 2. Suppose consumer spending increases. What happens to price, inflation, our GDP, and unemployment according to the rational expectations theory? Well, again, they have a vertical supply curve. So in their theory, aggregate demand is going to increase, but because wages are flexible, prices and inflation will rise, but our GDP and unemployment will not change. Okay, that concludes our lesson on the different theories of aggregate supply.